I keep smelling like llama. Is it llama, or goat? There's something in the earth. I can smell it. It's in the robes or something. Yeah. Where's it originally from?
Mongolia.
Yeah, where they would be.
Yeah, and then it came over, and then it was at the Temple of the Earth for a few years.
Yeah.
It was originally from Mongolia.
Yeah. I'm sure I'm smelling.
What is the insulation made of? Is that not lamb?
Wool. It's wool.
Lamb wool often is
Yeah, I can smell the animal anyway. Yeah.
it's not vegan.
How long was your trial?
So I was a bit hard.
Enjoying it? Challenge.
See how it goes heat-wise too.
Yes.
Yeah. Tomorrow's going to be warmer than today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Well, the phone.
Me that's enjoying it.
Yeah, but there's no breeze today. It's pretty unusual. Yeah.
Did you say that?
A little breeze would be nice.
Yeah, a little breeze.
I would like to breeze. It's coming later.
It's coming later, is it?
Okay, let's ask. We need a little breeze here.
A little breeze. It's not that kind of breeze.
Very sincere. I speak about it. And the whole group.
Yeah.
Not so good for the person over there.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Keep on.
Yeah. It's going to get tiring very soon, isn't it? Yeah.
No, she's very strong. She's a strong guy. Oh, you have some help.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Thank God. This is sincere.
So we might try to break again about 3 o'clock, just so everyone can have a bit of a breather. If it gets warmer in here, it might get a bit.
When you go out and it sort of takes all the heat out and then we come back in.
Yeah. In Australia, we find that people are tolerant for higher temperatures, so their brain doesn't turn off before 35, around about. But in Europe, we find the brain turns off a lot earlier.
In North Europe.
Not so much in
Not
North
here.
Europe.
Not in Northern, where you're tougher here.
Tougher here.
Tougher brain.
I don't think so. Most of us are not.
Yeah.
They are always turned on.
Yeah.
Never turned on the brain.
Yeah.
As long as you don't sit down and the brain turn off straight away.
Yeah.
That's the main thing.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we were discussing the conscience, and why have I raised the issue of the conscience with regard to this subject? God's standards of love is really the question. Because remember, we started off talking about we want to focus on God's standard of love, but there is an essential part of the conscience. If you understand the use of the conscience, you can see, can't you, that really the conscience is telling you the truth about what God's standard of love is. So the conscience is actually a great mechanism to determine what the standards are in terms of what God sees the standard of love is. The issue most of us face is that very few of us think about the conscience being a mechanism via which we can learn about love. We treat it, if we use the conscience at all, we just mostly think of it as a response, as a mechanism that tells us when we're guilty. In other words, when we're right or wrong. but we don't see it as telling us whether we're loving or not. But from God's perspective, what is loving is what is right, and what is wrong is what is unloving. So actually, the conscience mechanism, which is the mechanism by which God shares truth with you, is also very informative about whether you are loving or not. The conscience is sharing that with you. So one of the things that I learnt in my first century life, very early in my life, was that learning about the conscience and learning to ask God questions and be open to the responses of those questions, not only did it teach me what is right and wrong, but it also taught me what was loving and what was unloving at the same time. And this is a very important thing to understand about the conscience mechanism. So the conscience, you could say, remember it's a mechanism that belongs to the soul. So here's my soul, Mary in my case. And the conscience mechanism, and you could say, let's just draw it sort of here, the connection with God, God's version of love. So God's standard of love is really being told to me through the mechanism of the conscience. Now, whether I accept it or not is completely up to the exercise of my will. I don't have to accept it. God doesn't force me into accepting what God shares with me via the conscience. He does, however, have laws that correct me whenever I'm unloving. So if you think about it, if I'm responsive to the conscience, I also don't really need laws anymore, because the conscience is telling me what's right and wrong. And as long as I am humble enough to accept that, then basically I am living in harmony with the law as well, because all of the laws were created by God, and therefore I'm living by listening to God's truth on a matter. I'm also listening to God's law on the matter. What God says is the rules, basically, for life. So the big advantage of doing this, and it can be done at any age and at any event, at any thing that you may face in your life. And so what we have a tendency, Mary and I, to break those things down into sort of four major categories, which I've already mentioned, which are physical things you may choose to do, right? So anything that you choose to do physically, there is actually a right and a wrong to what you do. Now, what is right is what is loving. Now, many times there's multiple opportunities for one thing, for many things to be loving in one circumstance. So the beauty of acting in harmony with love is it gives you lots of options, you know, and we'll probably try to illustrate that practically over the coming day and a half. But also, it also can tell you what is wrong to do physically, like what actions are wrong to take physically in terms of in our physical day-to-day life. And then there's also the areas of sexuality, so which is a large area of your life. God designed it to be a large area of life, to bring you pleasure and to bring you joy in a relationship. But obviously there are also rights and wrongs there as well. And the conscience can inform you of what is right or wrong in that regard. And then there's also the emotional self, like what kind of things you may feel. So there is actually a right and wrong to your feelings as well, believe it or not. So a lot of people don't realise, but from God's perspective, acting in a physical manner is driven by the emotional feeling to act in that manner. And so the actual emotional feeling means you've, from God's perspective, already acted. And so the way I illustrated that in the first century, I said, even a man who looks at another woman when he's married to or with one partner, and he looks at another from in a sexual way, then he has already committed adultery in his heart. So that's an example of your emotions can actually be out of harmony with what is loving and truthful as well. So it's not just your physical actions, it's also your sexual behaviour, and it's not just those two, it's also your emotional feelings that the law measures, and also that our conscience can inform us that this feeling is wrong. So an example of that is sometimes, when you get angry, and then you maybe dump it on a child, like your own children or something, and then you have a time to think about it and you go, I've done the wrong thing there. That's your conscience bothering you about your emotions towards your children. So that's an example of how the conscience can inform you whether you've done the right thing emotionally or not, right? And then, of course, there's what I'd classify as spiritual. And those things are more like qualities that you can develop that are going to assist you for the rest of your existence. And there are some qualities that are going to harm you if they're inside of you for the rest of your existence. And true development of spirituality is developing in regards to the qualities that are going to help you and also help others and be loving and express truth. And then also removing from yourself the things that are unloving and unkind and untruthful, not humble. Those kind of things also need to be removed. And this is a part of your spiritual development. So you've got areas of your life where the conscience can assist you in, and every aspect of your life can be, if you're humble, you can be more open to being assisted in all of these different areas of your life. The issue that most of us face is that we are not very humble. We want to be our own lawmaker. So the problem with being our own lawmaker is that we come up with our own ideas of what is right or wrong spiritually. In other words, what is the truth, the spiritual truth of the universe? What is the emotional truth? In other words, what goes on inside myself? What is that emotional truth? What is my sexual truth and what is my physical truth? Often is very much in disharmony with what God feels is true, or what God feels we should be doing, in harmony with his moral law. And it's these areas where we need the conscience, where we need the sensitivity to be able to guide us into developing ourselves and our relationships. So if Mary and I, both of us together, decide that it's not my laws in our relationship that matter, and it's not Mary's laws that matter in our relationship, but rather it's the laws, the more sensitive we can become to the conscience, the more we can feel what God's laws are regarding our relationship. If we both decide that we are going to focus on that, God's laws, rather than our own law, can you see, eventually we're going to have a much better relationship, because both of us will be progressing towards an ideal goal. Make sense to you? If I keep my own laws and Mary keeps her own laws, eventually there's going to be conflict, because we come from two different families with their own injuries and with their own ideas about what's loving. Eventually there's going to be conflict, and unless both of us have a focus on what is God's standards, we are going to end up being in angry conflict with each other. Can you see that? Because we're in a different place with regard to what I believe the law is and what Mary would believe the law is. So the key actually to having happy relationships, whether it's with children, parents, our partners, the environment even, happy relationship with the world around us, is whether we are going to accept God's laws as real or not. Whether we're going to actually have that connection enough where God can share with us, these are my laws. If you work in harmony with those laws, you will be a happy person, right? And bear in mind that God's also not just interested in my happiness. Like in the relationship, God's not interested in me being happy and Mary being miserable. You understand? He wants both of us to be happy. So the problem is, many times in a relationship, what we observe is that one person's quite happy and content and the other person's quite miserable. And the reason why for that is because one person has set the law to be their own law, and the other person feels they have to conform to that law. So in the case, if it was Mary and myself, let's say I set the law, and historically many men have done this, right, in their families for millennia, really. They've set the law, and then they've enforced the law through violence on the rest of their family, and then the women then feel, oh, we've got to live by that law, otherwise we're going to be violently abused. And so then they conform to the law, but they're not happy. So God's not interested in that kind of relationship with us, or us having those kind of relationships with others. What God wants is for all parties to be happy. And not to just have the semblance of happiness or the illusion of it, but rather to actually be happy in their heart is what God's looking for. This is why he created law, so that you could be happy if you engage the law. In fact, the purpose of all of God's standards is to make you happier. So it's not to punish you, and it's not to degrade you, and it's not to make you feel bad all the time, and it's not any of those things, but it's to make you happier. Happier people, happier individuals, happier society, happier earth, happier environment, happier when you pass into the spirit world, same. The goal is to make you happier. So the purpose of the conscience is to help you be happier. So you could also say the purpose of God's standards is to help you be happier. When you hold on to your own standard, you are not going to be happier. As I think many of you have experienced in the past, right? Every time you've done that, it doesn't cause you to be happier. Right? And if you are happier, what about all the people around you? Are they also happier? Right? If you're engaging your own standards all the time, but you're expecting everyone around you to do what you feel are the standards, you might be happy, seemingly, but everyone else around you is going to be sad, angry, bitter, not really wanting your company, for the reason that they're not happy because your standards are out of harmony with God's. So it's a very important thing to ensure that our standards are in harmony with God's when it comes to these all areas, if you like, of our life. Not just with regard to our physical behaviour, but also even with regard to the way we feel. Even in regard to that. Yeah? Right. Now, are there any questions about that before we proceed? Yeah?
It's about the conscience.
Yep.
And I realize what Mary just talks about, that my parents' conscience interferes. Is the first thing becoming aware of that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
And then starting to be more aware, getting in fear or getting in shame. And yeah, what's the next step?
Well, yeah. Do you want
American.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and you can add.
Yeah.
What helped me was to really seek the truth about God's conscience. So, really understanding, wow, there's this mechanism that exists and it's foolproof and it's really there to help care for me in my life and so that I can care for me in my life. And then to feel really how disconnected I felt from it. That was actually very upsetting for me. I felt very, like a lot of grief that I lost this a long, long time ago. It hasn't been with me. And now I want it back, and I feel like I don't know how to do that, So I really had to go through a process of really fear and sadness about this disconnection. And then that helped me to sensitize to how afraid I was of being my own woman aside from my family, how much my family's approval was still important to me, how frightened I felt if I didn't have their approval. And so working through that was probably the major thing that really helped me then to really desire the connection with the conscience. When I first sort of kind of connected to this again, I felt upset that I wasn't connected to the conscience, but I wasn't realising I didn't actually want it because I wanted my family's approval more. So that process really helped me. And then exercising it kind of like a muscle, of seeking God's truth about things in every situation I was in. And then feeling, sometimes I could feel the disparity of that thing I said before, where I was like, oh, I've thought this is wrong my whole life. And now what I feel from God, that this is right, and I've been actually ashamed of things like my love of truth and being truthful with everyone was something that I felt was a very bad thing about me, and that I was doing the wrong thing if I was honest and particularly very transparent. And so there was grief and fear, I guess. And it was I guess it wasn't a one and done process, you know. I had to really desire the shift and feel my fear about making the shift at the same time, and the grief. And that really it's sort of a changing of course, if you like. Yeah. Yeah. Would you add to that? You would add to that? Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah. That's just, I think it's also important for most people to understand the dynamic of how their conscience got damaged. The dynamic of what actually happened in your life to cause the conscience to be something that you finish up sort of almost condemning in yourself. In fact, nowadays I see a lot of people in society condemning any moral standard. Like you see a lot in society how, and it's particularly in the younger generation, how there's almost like no standards anymore about sexuality or emotions being expressed or physical things acted upon and so forth. So let's just look, I think it's important to look at how it all happened to you. Does that make sense? So let's do that. And then what Mary said is very true in terms of the effect of it all. So if you remember these spheres that we had drawn, you can slightly still see them there. The Earth, as I said earlier, is in a state where it's well and truly in the middle of the first sphere. From God's perspective, actually, the Earth is in the state that the hells are in the first sphere. There's a place in the first sphere which is quite dark and very devoid of love on the average, and that's where the Earth is as well, the general condition of the Earth. So the Earth, you could say, is in this sort of almost hellish state. Not the depths of hell, though. Not the darkest of hell, but above it. And what I mean by above it is this. The average law, if you look at the average laws made by society, you can see that there are certain things that society views as wrong right now, isn't there? So how does society feel about murder?
Some places,
Yeah. Under certain circumstances.
An army can go and murder, yes. So government sanctioned murder is okay, but individual murder is wrong.
Again, it depends who you are. Some people
Microphone, no,
murder and they're protected, you know. It's
Let's do microphone though if you're going to make a comment, because nobody will hear it otherwise.
I think again, it's gotten so off course that it depends. Individuals right now are murdering other people and
Correct.
they're getting off with it. So it's not just
Correct.
government sanctioned. It's
Correct. But it's not, the general society is saying murder is wrong, isn't it? Generalised society.
generalized,
But there's a lot of caveats to that, isn't there? Like, under this circumstance and under that circumstance, and if it happens to you, and if that, there's a lot of caveats, but the general view is murder is wrong. If I just went out on a murder spree, the majority of society would condemn me, right? But, what about rape? Well, again, you can see the same thing applies, doesn't it? Generally, there's laws saying rape is wrong, but how many rapists actually get prosecuted? Yeah. Not a large amount. And if you talk about child abuse as rape, like less than 5% of child abusers actually get dealt with, right? So Again, society generally says it's wrong, but there are certain conditions under which society seems to accept it. When it comes to something like the treatment of children, generally society says child abuse is wrong, right? Yeah. Abusing a child is wrong. However, if that's the case, why do 50 million children die every year from starvation? Obviously there's a problem there as well, you know, but again, these are general statements. So you could say society is saying that there's a certain band, if you like, of space, moral space, that you have where you're allowed to operate in. And if you go below that space, there's more likelihood that you will be punished, or more likelihood that you'll be condemned by your friends and neighbours. And if you stay in that space, it's more likely you'll be approved. You'll be accepted by society. So you could say this is an approval band, really, can't you? It's really a band in which you're approved of. Or you could say approved behaviour. Now here we're only looking at physical behaviour too, because like how many people actually have an abusive sexual feeling towards women? Like almost every man I've ever met has it. And yet that's okay. But from God's standard, that's not okay. But human standard is, well, it's just a feeling, so it's okay. At least he hasn't acted upon it, right? So there's an approved set of behaviour, you could say, right, where I'm allowed to do certain things, and those things will be approved of. But if I go below those things that are approved of, then I'm more likely going to get the attack of a higher number of society than before. A large number of society will condemn my behaviour if I go below that standard. So you could say this is like a standard of love, couldn't you? That really has been established. What humans believe love is, and this sort of becomes our standard. So this approved behaviour is a de facto standard of behaviour, a de facto standard of love that the world exists in. And unfortunately, it's in the hells. So that means that we're going to get a lot of bad results because what everybody thinks love is, love actually isn't. Now, there are some areas where this is actually very obvious, like murder and rape. Generally, most people will say, oh, well, that's wrong, right? But there are other areas that are very wrong from God's perspective, but most people on earth think are right. An example of that is how we treat children. Yep. So that there's a very growing standard on earth that we should treat children and give them all this space and all this latitude to do whatever they want whenever they want. Because most of us, as my age or older, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, most of us didn't get to do what we wanted, and we feel quite angry about it. And so we want our children to do whatever they want, not understanding that from God's point of view, that standard is actually very unloving. And in fact, from God's perspective, it's abusive to the child, which is very interesting, actually, because and the way it's abusive is the child won't know how to actualise itself unless it's educated in as wide variety of things as possible. It won't know what to choose. And so what most of us don't realise is that when we allow a very permissive state with our children, which is happening more and more on earth now, you even see it with little toddlers ruling the entire household. You know what I mean? Like whatever the little toddler screams about, everybody runs to its rescue, does whatever it wants. It can scream for anything and it gets whatever it wants. And this is very abusive to the child to allow this to continue, but most parents don't know how to correct it because they have learnt that I can't smack the child to correct it. So what do? Like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to educate this child that what it's doing is unloving to the rest of us. You know, and so most of them then tolerate the child doing it, not understanding that actually the child, not without any correction, is actually being abused, because its future life is going to be tainted by the attitudes that are developing within the child. And this is something that most of you are going to find very challenging to hear, right? Because many of you have grown up thinking, I had a bad, the abuse of me was more obvious, like I was belted, in my case with a strap, many of you with a cane or something like that by your parents even. In fact, many of you, if you were brought up in a Christian household, there's a quote from the Bible that says, spare the rod, spoil the child, right? So most Christian households go, well, God wants me to smack my kids. And they use that as a justification to do it. So after a while, you end up going, you end up thinking, the parents ended up thinking, this was the way to encourage the child to be more loving. Not really, right? What it did was make us afraid, made us afraid of violence, made us more prone to violence and other things like that, or made us more tolerant of people just doing whatever they want whenever they want as well. So there's a whole heap of injuries that have grown up there, but because it's within the approved behaviour of society, it's acceptable. And by the way, many of you here have created your own society. So your approved things in society will be based around what you created as your society. And that will be different to what I've created as my society. And that'll be different to what, somebody in Austria creates as their society, right? So this approved behaviour generally goes up and down a little bit in terms of how loving it is from God's perspective. But generally, it's very much the same no matter what people choose to do on earth, because hardly anybody is considering God's standard. What is God's standard of love? And because many people on earth are not receiving God's love, they don't automatically know what God's standard of love is. And because also they're not receiving any truth via the conscience, they're suppressing the conscience, they're not receiving any moral truth about what God's standard of love is there either. So in the end, all of us start setting up our own standard, which unfortunately is going to be very much about our history and what's happened to us as to what standard that will be. Right? So here we are. Remember, there's spheres above this. First, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so forth, right? Up to the perfect natural man is what we're talking about here. And even beyond that, which is what we need to talk about more tomorrow. But you can see that society is going to let you be in that area. It's going to let you operate in that area. Now, that area isn't very high from God's perspective. It's very low. It's very low. So the standard that we have on earth is so low that whenever we just go a little bit, like all we need to be, let's put the mark in our orange, which is the standards of love, all we need to be is a bit higher here, and everybody looks at us as a goody-goody. And it's not cool to be a goody-goody, is it? So that's uncool to be that high of standard of love, even just above where society, or just below where society feels the limit is. You can't really go higher than that. But then if you go lower than here, you're a baddie, right? People want to generally stay away from you. Not all people, of course. If you're a drug addict and a murderer, then you'd be happy with that, right? But if you're, someone who's, wanting to progress more, then you won't be happy with that, and the average of society is not happy with that. So you can see the standard that you're allowed to be is very, very restricted. You can't go too good, and you can't go too bad. You have to stay in there. And this creates a problem for anyone who wants to have God's standards. Because God's standards are way up here. And this is society saying you can't go there. Right? In fact, you'll find the more you go there, the average person in society condemns you more for going there, which creates its own restriction. And particularly if you're worried about what people think of you, which most people on earth are, it creates your own restriction where you won't go any higher than what society is allowing you to go. Now, this also works in your family. So let's say Mary and I are together. I have my levels of how much Mary's allowed to progress. Let's say they're here. Halfway in this approved behaviour of society. That's where I want Mary to be. Right? And I'm happy with Mary when she's there. I think she's a great woman when she's there. I think she's perfect for me when she's there. I think I want to give her gifts to help her stay there. Does that make sense? Like, it's really self-absorbed, isn't it? I'm really wanting her to be in a place just for my own sake, but this is often what we're like in a relationship. So I want her to stay there. Now let's say Mary, she hears some of God's truth through the operation of her own conscience. And she realises that where I want her to be is not where she should be. So let's say she hears a bit of God's truth from the conscience, which is, why do you keep just agreeing with him all the time when you don't agree? Right? Now, that's not Mary's problem, by the way. A lot of people think it is, but it's definitely not Mary's problem, as Mary will tell you. But we're just raising it as an idea, right? So let's say God's sharing with her via the conscience that when she agrees with me out in her word, but she doesn't agree with me in her feelings, she's being untruthful. And let's say God shares that with Mary through the conscience, and Mary ponders that for a while, and she goes, well, yeah, that's right. Like, it's dead right. I'm not being truthful. I'm sort of living a lie with this man, right? So she, because her conscience bothers her about it, she may start to go, well, I need to be more truthful. So she starts being more truthful with me. So I want her to stay there. I want her to lie to me a lot, because when she lies to me, like, she butters me up and she makes me feel good about myself, and so I want her to not be honest about everything. So when I leave my dirty washing on the floor, Mary's lovely. Before, she was lovely. She picked it up for me and she washed it. Now she's honest and she said, I don't want to do that anymore. And I'm going, but you don't love me anymore. My standard of love says this is what you do if you love me. And she's going, no, I don't want to do that anymore. It's wrong. And I'm going, no, it's not wrong. It's loving. You don't love me anymore. Right? Can you see how easy it is for another person to start criticising your behaviour, even if you want to progress, just because of what they want? It's got nothing to do with God's standards. If I had God's standards, I would go, why am I leaving my clothes on the floor? That's not the same as God's standards, because God's tidy. And, God's organised. Imagine if God was untidy. If God was untidy, one day you'd have oxygen and the next day you wouldn't. Isn't that true? Like, if he hadn't organised consistency in your life, one day you'd be fine, having a good breathe, and the next day you'd be struggling for oxygen because of the lack of consistency, right? So me being untidy, not good. But if I'm not self-reflective, I'm gonna need somebody to actually say to me, you're actually wrong, right? So I need Mary. If she is more connected to her conscience, I really need her to say, you're actually wrong. And being untidy and leaving all your clothes all around is wrong. From God's perspective, it's wrong, right? It's not what you should be doing. You're lacking personal responsibility. That is wrong. You're forcing me to do something that you don't do for yourself. That's wrong. right? There's a whole heap of ways why it's wrong. And if Mary's just feeling the conscience and all the conscience has to say is what he's doing is wrong, it doesn't even have to tell her why it's wrong, but it'd be nice if she knew. But if she just trusted what he's doing is wrong, I need to stop it. Can you see? Because I want this standard of love that I have, is going to go, what are you doing? I'll be upset, won't I? And potentially even in a rage. And potentially, people get violent on these issues sometimes, right? That's how extreme it goes when they don't have their standard of love, so-called love, met, right? Now, if I was sincere and I noticed myself doing that, I would stop it, wouldn't I, if I was sincere? But unfortunately, the majority of us are not sincere either. We are demanding this certain level of love, the level of love that we've grown up with and we think is right. And by the way, it's very different for men and women as well. Like the level of love required from a woman is much higher than the level of love required from a man on the planet at the moment. In other words, a woman has to be more loving than the man under most, society conditions. That is a general feeling of acceptance, and even the women accept that. Many of you women do accept that, right? Many of you even say to each other, we're more loving than the men are. Isn't that
Proudly.
true? Proudly. Right. So you've even accepted that as real, but you do nothing about it, generally. Aside from just divorcing all men. Getting rid of all men is not the answer, by the way.
It's not loving.
It's not loving. Because it's not loving, it's not the answer, right? But the standards of love we have in a relationship are going to determine, aren't they, to a large degree, what finishes up happening to this relationship. And the same goes with the earth, actually. The standard of love you have towards the earth is going to end up determining what happens to this earth. Whether you can even live in it. It's going to determine that much, right? The standard of love you have. The standard of love you have is going to determine every relationship, every friendship, every partnership, every business arrangement, and what happens to the environment. And that's a sobering thought, really. If the earth is in this very narrow band, which is actually from God's perspective in a hellish band of love, and that standard of love is going to determine collectively, as well as individually, our future, then you can see there should be a strong imperative in the majority of us to be much more self-reflective and start wanting to raise our own standard of love, because the reality is the only standard of love you can change is your own. You don't have the power to change anybody else's. You have the power to inspire people, but not the power to change them. That belongs to them alone. Right? So unless I say to myself, this standard of love is no longer acceptable even to me, and I start adjusting it and start wanting to hear what God's standard of love is, there's a high likelihood that not only will I be unhappy, but also I am going to cause more and more destruction in my own life and the lives of others, as well as with the environment and the earth itself. That's going to be the potential. So getting back to Nellie's question and Mary's answer, you can see that as long as I stay in this approved behaviour, and that approved behaviour is going to be determined by the people you care about the most. So if that's your family, the approved behaviour line is going to be your family's line. If that's your business relationships, then your approved behaviour is going to be in the line of whatever those business people think. If it's to do with your partner, then the approved behaviour will be whatever your partner thinks is approved. Right? The problem with, in almost every case, is that it's not God's standard. So therefore, it's going to cause trouble in the future. Did I just cut out?
No.
That makes sense? So if you look at Nell's question, you can see that while you stay in this range of behaviour, everyone around you will be relatively happy. But as soon as you try to improve your condition of love, you can see there's a potential that everyone around you is going to start being very unhappy. And for the majority of us, we can't bear that. Emotionally, we haven't learnt how to bear that. And so that pulls us back down to be within the band. So to stay in this band, I must ignore the conscience. Because the conscience is prompting me, get out of that band's not loving. The conscience is telling me it's not a loving thing to stay there. But because everyone in society, or everyone that I am in society with, is telling me stay there, there's now a very strong motivation for me to ignore what my conscience is saying and stay there. And this is what happens to many people who hear divine truth. They start getting out of the band, and the people around them start attacking them for the changes being made. And as a result of that, the person feels inclined to go back within the band, or even worse, do divine truth on the sly. On the sly, like in secrecy. So in other words,
as a side hobby.
While I'm by myself, I do what the conscience and God's telling me to do. But as soon as I'm with someone else, I modify my behaviour so they can't tell that's what I'm doing. You follow? And that's even worse state, because now you're entering a state of duality, and you're compromising principles that you know that are good for the sake of principles you know are bad. And that's a very damaging thing to do to your soul, to do that. There's going to be a lot of guilt in that, because the Lord is going to condemn you for that. God's laws will condemn you for that. So the real problem is, I need to be prepared to get out of this band no matter what anybody around me thinks. No matter what they feel, no matter how much they're upset with me about it, no matter how much they pressure me, no matter, even if they're going to kill me, I'm going to get out of the band. That's how strong it's going to have to be to get out of the band, to get out of this acceptable, approved area. And what I find is that most people on earth don't have the courage to do it. And it's only in the spirit world that they start to develop the courage, because as you progress in the spirit world, your environment automatically changes, and you can see the change, and so that you're surrounded by people who are also changing, and so that makes your life easier. So that's one advantage of spirit world. Of course, you haven't learnt to do much on your own will, because everybody else around you is doing the same thing. So that's a disadvantage. The advantage of doing it on earth is you develop a strong will, a courageous will, a strong will, a will that can handle anything. Now that's going to stand you in good stead for your future, that will.
One thing I've noticed in the last 10 years or so is that even within people that follow divine truth, we create a bands,
yeah.
And we're telling ourselves we're doing better, but we're not really doing it at all.
Correct.
And there's only a very small group of people actually doing it, as you know. So
Yes.
it's just something, because of the new people here, I thought was important to realise. We have to,
You have to be prepared to raise your own condition no matter what anybody else around you believes, even if those beliefs purport to be the same as your own.
And it gets used against you. We can temptably use it to manipulate, don't we? We use those language and use that word to...
Yeah, I've seen many people use what they learn about God's truth to manipulate others to get into a worse condition. Yeah, which is it's a very dark thing to do, actually. To manipulate another person using so-called truth to manipulate them into a worse condition, very dark thing to do. And yet we see people doing that all the time. Yeah. Yep. Olga? You just-
I wonder if it's necessary to actually also physically leave the environment, or to stay in it and confront the people.
Good. Yeah, good question. Remember what we said were the four main aspects of your life. What were they?
Spiritual, emotional, physical, and
Sexual. Okay. So let's go in terms of order of priority. That would be physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual.
Yes.
Right? So that's the order of ascending priority. So when it comes to your physical environment, you want to create an environment that is enabling you to progress beyond these conditions, don't you?
Yes.
Yep. If you stay in an environment where this is the approved behaviour and you keep staying in it over and over and over again, then how more difficult is it going to be for you to get out of that environment?
Very difficult.
Very difficult, right? So at some point, there are going to be physical changes you're going to have to make, as well as sexual ones, as well as emotional ones, and as well as spiritual ones. Right? There's going to be beliefs you'll have to change. There's going to be emotions you have to change. There's going to be sexual behaviour and feelings you're going to have to change. And there's also going to be physical things you're going to have to do to make those changes. Right? You could say you need to create a space that enables your change. Now, if you're living with a partner, let's say I'm living with Mary and she wants to change, and I'm set. I feel she needs to, do things, even on a physical level, do things like pick up my washing, wash it for me, iron it, put it in my cupboard. Even if I feel that, can you see, every time she doesn't do that, what am I going to do?
I'm going to blame her.
Well, first I'll try reasoning with her. Don't you know you should be more loving? You're not loving to me. Yeah? You've been doing this before, and the more you've listened to that Jesus character, the more unloving you've become. Understand? So this is not good. He's bad for you. Stop, And I've seen some guys even bash the telly. Like, literally destroy their own telly to stop their girl from watching anything to do with more truth, right? People will go to that length, because they want to stop their partner from making the change that's going to challenge them into a higher condition of love. So I'll start just this. I've given a talk years and years ago about bribery, threats, blackmail, and all those things. Well, we normally start with the bribery. Like, if I wash my clothes, will you stop listening to this divine truth crap? You seem to be upset about me not washing my clothes and not drying them and not ironing them and everything. I'll do that. Stay with me. I'll do that. I promise you. But you've got to stop listening to this crap, because it's crap, right? Got to stop listening to it. So a bit of bribery there, right? And Mary goes, let's say she has a bit of fortitude, a bit of courage, and she goes, oh, what am I going to do now?
Threaten.
If you don't stop, I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to make your life so hard. I'm going to break up with you, and you know how you want me for security. You're not going to get any. I'm going to take you to the cleaners financially. I'm going to make sure that you're destitute. So what am I doing now? I'm working on her fear. Her fear. Right, so work on a fear.
Nope.
No. What do I do now? Now, from now on, it depends on how good I think I am as to what I'll do. If I think I'm really good and I'm really developed, I won't hit her, I won't get violent with her, but I'll do all the things I just promised. I'll make it happen.
And you probably do things like, well, now I'm going to tell all your family and all
your
friends that
what you've done to me.
Yeah.
We got married, you did these things for me, and now you're not doing them. And you're in a cult. You know, all I've got to do now is say, oh, there's this guy in Australia claiming he's Jesus, and my woman's in a cult now. And all of the family go, yeah, she's in a cult. Yep. So what are they?
Intervention.
Intervention. You know, like, and we've had actually some people we've now become friends with who, right back in the beginning, they've even tried to drug them and all sorts of things to stop them from making any change. Right? Of course, the more violent the action becomes, the more obvious it is that the person doesn't love you, right? Yep. But it's pretty tough still being in that environment. Okay, so I'm now in my violent stage, and the limit of my violence is going to be determined only by how much I think I'm a good guy. Really. So if I think I'm an okay guy to belt Mary, I'll belt her. But if I don't think I'm an okay guy to belt her, then I won't. If I think I'm an okay guy to make her life a misery throughout all sorts of other methods, I'll do that. But if I think I'm not an okay guy if I do that, then I won't do that either. You follow? But it's just how much pressure will I bring to bear to get her to stay where I want her to be is going to be very dependent upon my condition and my self-awareness. Right? And Mary is going to need courage, isn't she, to deal with all that. Can you see that? If she wants to get God's standards, she's going to need courage to deal with all that. Courage to deal with my potential levels of abuse that I bring to bear. Now, I'm saying this in a personal relationship, but the reality is often it happens with family members, where parents get all upset. We've had lots of parents go, you're in a cult now, and look what you're doing, and you know, you shouldn't be raising with us. We were bad parents. We were never bad parents. We did all the right things with you, even though we belted you and whatever else we did. We did all the right things with you. How dare you raise these things with? We're your parents. You should listen to us more than listen to anybody else. In other words, we're your parents, so we're your gods, is really the underlying thought. And so often parents bring this pressure to bear. It can even be children that bring this pressure to bear. We've had some people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s with grown children, and when they start making changes, the children are in a protest, you know, and they do as much as they possibly can, even trying to get their mother or father committed so they can take all their money off them so they have no freedom, even things like that, right? All you have to do is say they're in a cult, and you get away with a lot after that, right? That's what happens. Obviously, you're not in a cult, because Mary and I have no interest in telling you what to do with your life. We have an interest in educating you what God's standards are. But we don't ring you up every day and say, checking on you. Checking on you. What did you do today? How did you treat Andy today? What has he done to you? You imagine our life would be a nightmare, wouldn't it? If we did that. So all we do is we present the truth to you and let you do what you want with it, right? So a cult doesn't do that, by the way. A cult presents the truth to you and enforces it, right? And condemns you and actually, in the end, excommunicates you if you don't do it, right? So.
And I guess the flip side of that is, because you're talking to Olga about can you stay in the same environment and make changes? I suppose the flip side of it is some people try to create then a false environment where they're going to be safe to do all of their emotional work, and that doesn't work either, because you're basically trying to isolate yourself from reality to grow, and you can't do that either.
In order to avoid your own emotions, really.
Yes. Yeah. So the key principle is humility, as I think I said to you in Austria.
Yeah.
But also doing things that are loving for yourself from God's perspective.
Yeah. My general recommendation is this: stay in the environment you're in until such a time as it becomes very clear to you that in your environment people around you are not going to accept you staying there. Then leave.
Because a lot of times when we consider change, we have all these beliefs about how everyone's going to react, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. You know, and it's not really giving people a chance if you just prejudge how they're going to react. Yeah.
You don't know how people will respond to truth. You don't know how they're going to respond to you becoming more loving. You don't know. Some people respond well, others don't. It just depends on their own level of self-reflection. And also, nothing I've found is actually permanent. I've had people in the first century kill me for the position I took, and then later in the spirit world, they've become my friends. So it's sort of like, well, nothing's really permanent in regard to the response either. Particularly on Earth, it's like, how long does Earth last? 80, 90 years, maybe 100 if you're unlucky. Well, in the environment we're in, it's unlucky that it's that long. But if you think about it, a lot of the people who become your enemies on Earth will eventually become your friends later. There's all sorts of changes they may make, realizations they may have. Nothing's really as permanent as we believe it to be. And so that's a part of the things we need to consider, right? The beauty of looking at everything from God's perspective is that it's God's perspective. It's a long-term, like, proper perspective. It's the reality of existence, right? Our perspective as we are on Earth, particularly in our first incarnation on Earth, we're so limited in our perspective of things because, like, most of you, well, all of you pretty much, have not entered the spirit world yet, right? So you don't even know what the spirit world looks like. You don't even know what experiences you might have. You don't even know yet what things you could enjoy. You don't know even yet how to progress in the spirit world. There's a whole heap of things you yet to learn, and that applies to everybody. So besides yourself, so if you progress on Earth, the people around you might not like your progress, but at the end of the day, once you're in the spirit world, you'll probably be very instrumental in helping them progress. The very people who didn't like you. You know, that's been my case, and it's been Mary's case. So I'm sure it will be yours in the future as well. So we need to get some perspective about where we are at with love. We need to face the reality of where the world is. We need to face that it's not God's standard. And then we need to go, well, what am I going to do about that now?
Yeah, and can I add there, it's very important in this process where we're talking about change and changing in relationships and lifting our standards. It's so important to have God's perspective on ourselves and where we are in that as well. Because often I hear people come to a talk like this and they're like, yeah, that's right, all these other people are so wrong. But they haven't really established where they're at in relation to God's standard of love. And so you can't neglect that in this process because you'll be tempted otherwise.
It has to be your primary focus.
It has to be the first port of call for you because otherwise you are going to start applying your injured standards, not God's standards, to your life and trying to kind of force other people around you to meet the standards, which is really where you started from, why the problems began in the first place.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yep. Keep your hand up. So.
Hello. So I have 2 questions. One is I just wasn't clear, but are we going to actually? Are you going to explain God's standards to us, or is it something we're going to have to discover for ourselves? Of love, standards of love.
Well, this is a very interesting question. Am I going to explain God's standards of love to you? Well, I might explain some, but how is that going to help you with your individual lives? See, your individual lives, you're going to come up, I'm not going to be around you 24/7. I've just told you I'm not a cult leader, so I'm not going to follow up. I'm not going to do all that.
I don't expect you to. I just wondered if you're going to share what you discovered for yourself.
Ah, yes, I don't mind doing that, and we will do some of that tomorrow. Obviously, in the amount of time we've only really got 10 hours together, haven't we? And already we've used like 4 of them. So obviously my ability to share with you all the different standards of love, bearing in mind there must be millions. Yep, and there is actually millions of different things. Of course they are guided by a few principles, but in terms of individual laws, there's millions. So, of course, when you engage principle rather than law, you can sort of reduce the principles down to about 15 or 20 and you pretty much can't go wrong. But And we've already done that in the presentation in 2019.
I thought we said
19
the 50th group you're talking about.
was about God's law, but the trouble is it's not on the net, is it?
Oh no, 2016 you're talking about. Sorry.
16,
Yeah,
God's
16.
Yeah, the last group
Yeah.
in 2016 we did, which was about the principles that guide all of God's laws.
God's laws of love.
God's laws of love.
God's loving laws.
God's loving laws, it was called. And if you watch that, you'll see there's a lot of principles that you can apply to any law. And it's very handy to apply principles to things rather than individual laws to things. But the reality is there are millions of laws, and it's impossible for me to share everyone with you in the time we have. But also, it's important for you to develop your relationship with God so that you don't need me to determine what the truth is. Because the trouble with needing a person to tell you what the truth is you become dependent on the person. And if that person dies, what do you do?
Well, just because we have a moment with you here in time and space,
Yeah.
I thought, wow, these are gems that could be like, just if you give us one example.
I will. But it's more important that you learn the principle.
Yeah.
You understand?
Fair enough.
So very important. So I will do what you're asking, and Mary and I will do this over the next couple of days. And if you're here a week later, we'll do the same. But it's important for you to understand the principle so you can do it for yourself. Right? That's the key here. The key here is that you can learn through your relationship with God and what God's standards are. You can develop your own conscience. You can put that into practice in your own day-to-day life. It's very important that you focus on doing that rather than getting told things. Now, it is beautiful when somebody tells you something. I agree. It's sort of like one of the things that I've felt quite a lot is in my own progress is no one's told me anything and I've had to discover everything myself. Now, aside from God, of course, God tells me things, but aside from that, if I'm out of harmony with God, I've got to work it out. So the problem with that I've found is that I've really, when you say it's a problem, it's not really a problem, but it tends to make things a bit longer because you've got to discover things. Now, what I'm trying to do with you guys is give you a mixture of both things. Tell you some things, but also encourage you to discover things. Make sense? Mm-hmm. If you can discover things in your relationship with God, then you will have a closer relationship with God. If you only discover things through my interaction with you, then your relationship with God will be compromised because you won't be as close to God as you could be. And what I would like is for you to be as close to God as I am, because that's where the joy comes. So that's why we want to do it this way, right? So that's your first question, though. What was your second one?
So my second question is about the word God and this idea of God, which I always grew up like, I don't know if there's God, maybe there is, maybe it's the creation, the universe, like all these words, and I'm finding that I have this resistance to the word God.
Very good point, yes,
Mm-hmm.
most do.
And I'm wondering, like, okay, this is an idea planted in my head that there is a God and it's called God, and then when I try, let's say, to talk to God, then I feel it's like something superficial that I'm doing because I was told there is a God.
Yeah.
And I'm like trying to, I guess I don't know exactly how to phrase what I'm wondering if you could help, like how I can come to it in a more like authentic way that feels more natural to me.
Very good question. We actually answered that question in the last two groups. We talked about these things a bit, and we've, in the sense of, firstly, do you in your heart really feel that God is real? Like the entity of God is a real entity. And, you know, we talked about many ways that you can discover whether God is real, but the important thing is, if you do not feel God is real, then it's unlikely you will desire to connect to God through the conscience, and it's also unlikely that you'll desire to receive love from God. So resolving the issue for yourself as to whether God is real or not is a very important thing to do.
Yeah. And it's important to start from the point of not knowing. Like what you really described is, I actually don't know. So now I'm trying to engage with all these things you're talking about, but it doesn't feel real because I don't actually know. And that's actually very good personal insight, because if you can go into this, if you like, there's a concept being presented to you with a seeking heart, not a prejudiced heart, like, oh, it can't be, or yes, it's definitely got to be. Oh, is it real? And really let that question settle in your heart, and then you will receive an answer, and then that will be your own. It will be authentic, if that makes sense. But it'll be a process, because there's all these things from your past that have prejudiced you against God or made you opposed to the idea of like a Christian God and wanting it to be everything is God. And so there'll be all these things that you'll have to want to discover the emotional roots of, because a lot of them have nothing to do with God, but things that people have done in the name of God, or the way people who purport to have a relationship with whatever God they say, how they've affected you. Yeah. Does that make sense?
What Mary said
I'm
to you?
saying?
Yeah.
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 That's good.
Yeah, thank you.
Just checking. Oh, come forward. Yeah.
Yes. Could you again say what intuition is to you? Because, yeah.
Yep. Intuition is a soul-based attribute. So perhaps I need to back one step before we talk about intuition itself. When your soul was created, there are certain potentials that your soul was given versus instinctual things that your soul was given. So if we divide, and remember I'm talking about the one soul, which is including of its two halves, so of which you are one half. So here we've got the whole soul. I don't know where S came from there, but it's an F. So here's our whole soul. In the soul, when God created your soul, He created it initially, and there's a whole heap of souls still in this condition actually, where He created it with what you would call or classify as personality. Or another word for that might be a certain type of nature. Right? So God created each individual soul with a different personality and nature actually. So there's not one soul Mary and I have met ever that has the same personality and nature as another. And in fact, in the spirit world, this is how we don't have names in the highest. In the celestial heavens, there's no names of people really. And you know the person because of their soul-based personality signature. It's sort of like that's their name, whatever their signature is. And this personality and nature God has created directly. You can enhance it by developing it, but you can't change it. Does that make sense to you? So with the personality and nature you've been given by God, you cannot modify it. You can try to suppress it, which people do on earth a lot, and also in the spirit world. You can also try to modify it, but it's not going to get modified. All you can do is embrace it and grow in your emotional capacity to express it. That makes sense? So that's a part of you. That's your individual nature. Separate to that is a whole heap of potentials that God gave your soul. Now, these potentials are broken into two primary areas. There's potentials that are gifted to the soul as a perfect human. So you could say human potential. And then there's also a set of potentials that are gifted to the soul only through your relationship with God. You could call that divine potential. You follow me? But these are only potentials. They are not gifts given to you without you asking for them and developing them and embracing them yourself. And these potentials involve two primary areas. one area is the potential of your personality and nature, but the other area is the potential of your character, your moral character. In other words, what you believe is right, what you believe is wrong, what you believe is good, what you believe is bad, what you do in your life, your behaviour, the way in which you act in your life. That could all be summed up as your character. Right? Now, that character, if you engage your potentials in the human soul development potential, which is the perfect natural way of love, then that character can only go to a point of a certain point, which is the perfect human, and beyond that you can't really develop it. And your personality and nature also can only be developed to a certain point, because there's a limit based in your soul, because you can never be divine. To become divine, you must receive love from God. You must. Now, if you choose to decide that you want to become divine, now the potential of your development in your personality and nature continuously grows infinitely, and so does the development of your character grow infinitely. You change as you go, and it becomes more godlike as you go, but still with your individual personality and nature being expressed. Yeah? So if you sort of think about all that, what was your original question?
What do you refer to as intuition?
Right, so intuition is a potential given to your soul that you can choose to develop, either to the point where it's the perfect natural human, or you can develop it to include the divine. But it's a quality of the soul, an attribute of the soul gifted to you in its undeveloped state. And you must learn to develop it. Right? Now, in terms of its definition, intuition is the ability to sense what's going on around you without needing words or obvious indications through your senses. And what I mean by that is, instead of seeing something, so reading body language is not intuition. Reading body language is just a scientific principle. Yeah? That's not intuition. Intuition is beyond that, because it allows you to see the things that are not expressed, but you can feel them being expressed as a part of your soul qualities. You can feel what's happening around you. Now, there's two sources of intuition. One is the intuition that you develop for yourself, and the other is the intuition you receive from other people, their intuition being expressed to you. An example of that is what many of you call intuition is not actually intuition. It's a spirit who is guiding you, telling you his intuition or her intuition.
Or her sense of what's happening.
Her sense of what's happening. Or his sense of what's happening.
Giving you knowledge of what they see that you maybe wouldn't see otherwise.
And that's not the same as you developing your own intuition. So we see a lot of people in New Age circles in particular have become very reliant on the intuition of spirits, thinking that it's their own intuition, when actually they are very undeveloped with their own intuition. They're just receiving knowledge from spirits, and they have a very strong connection to those spirits, receiving that knowledge, but actually their own ability to develop their own intuition is quite stunted, because they've become reliant on the spirit's intuition or the spirit's knowledge. Does that make sense to you as well, what I'm saying there?
And by spirits, you're not referring to beings of light, you're referring to...
What you call beings of light are all spirits, are all people who lived on Earth, and all of them are in different states of development. What many people call spirits of light on Earth are actually only in the second sphere or at the top of the first sphere, because to be a spirit of light, in terms of perception on Earth, all you have to be is above the band of what's normal on Earth. Does that make sense to you? So all you have to be a spirit of light and to appear to somebody on Earth as if you're bright, all you have to be is in a slightly better condition than they are. And so many times there's this claim on Earth that, there's this being of light that you're with you, and it's really Dad who's died 3 centuries ago, or 3 centuries, or
3 decades.
decades ago, and he's had the chance to grow a bit in love, and he's brighter than you are. And well, whoever, whatever, everything. He may not. He may know who he is and everything, but quite often it's also spirits from history who come to share things with you. You know, oftentimes they're even earthbound, but they're still in a better condition of love than most people on earth. And so most people on earth who ever think about it think those spirits of light. But the reality is they're just people who lived on earth who have managed to grow probably beyond your own condition, and therefore be able to, because of that, they have greater powers than you have, greater ability to inspire you, great ability to give you what you think is intuition, but actually is frequently their inspiration coming from them. So yeah, but in terms of developing your own intuition, well, that's a quality you can develop for yourself, and that's a quality that God gifted you as a potential to develop, but does not direct your development of it. He doesn't boss you around and tell you how to develop it. You need to determine that for yourself. Yep. Make sense?
Yeah, and yeah, because we were just talking about the question about whether God exists.
Yep.
Very often we meet people who have what they call an intuition that God exists. It's because they have spirit guides who have a relationship with God, who tell them, no, God exists, give it a go, you know. And then other people don't have guides yet, or maybe never will have guides, who have a relationship with God, and they often receive other answers that they call their gut feeling or their intuition, but it's really the spirits with them giving them their impressions of what they think is important or real.
Or what they think God is.
What they think God is, what's real, what's...
So in New Age circles, a lot of times people say we're all God, we're all divine. It's not a truth, it's not God's truth. When you connect to God, He'll tell you quite clearly, I created none of you divine. You were all created from God, but not with any part of God's divinity in you until you ask for it. So you know, it becomes very clear when you have a relationship with God what's actually happening. But for the majority of people on earth, there's this strong feeling they want to sort of feel like they're gods before they're even asked God to desire some of God's attributes or qualities. Not understanding free will, because free will demands that actually you have to ask for them. Otherwise, God's forcing it on you, and God's not going to do that. So, yeah. Yep.
This map of attributes of standards of love for each of the spheres is what I was studying and practicing, and I received the feedback that no, this is not God's way. How the practice of the qualities of the soul for each of the spheres relates to the development of the potential, and how
I understand
doing that
question.
is not doing God's way.
Okay. The natural love way, which is the path to becoming the perfect natural human, for most people it becomes quite an intellectual exercise. And what that intellectual exercise becomes is like, what do I need to do to get into the next sphere? What things do I need to develop? What attitudes, emotions do I need to develop to get to the next sphere? But also, what do I need to deal with from my past and get rid of in order to get to the next sphere? So what happens a lot of the times when a person's engaging this process intellectually is you get very bound to your intellect trying to work out what your next thing should be. When you're connected to God, God just tells you what the next thing is. And you just do that. And then the next thing, God tells you, and you do that. And the next thing, it's just like sort of like a seamless process where you're not now using your mind so much to develop attributes. You will need to think about things though. Because God gave you a brain. Well, it's not the actual physical body's brain. It's the spirit body's brain that actually is your mind. God gave you that mind so that you could work through things intellectually as well as emotionally. Right? He didn't expect that you would be given a mind and then not use it. But it needs to be subservient to the soul qualities. When we develop our brain in such a way, and this is what happens for many who pass into the spirit world, they go, I can't really connect to God. I can't really feel God. I can't really feel any of God's emotions. I can't even hardly feel most of my own emotions. By the time most of us pass, we've suppressed a lot of our emotional life just because it's too painful to regurgitate. And also by the time we pass, we're old now, and there's a lot of things we've lost. Like if I pass 20 years before Mary passes, then she's had 20 years without me. That's a pain that she needs to feel. If she doesn't feel it, she'll pass with that feeling, and then that feeling is going to govern to a degree what happens after that in her life. So you can see that there's losses that you have, and the older you get, generally the more losses you have as well. And so you end up with this state by the time you pass generally that is quite like full of a lot of grief that's not yet felt, right? And also fears that are not yet felt, because as people approach their death, their fear of death intensifies. This is why many people become very focused on health rather than spiritual health, is because their fear of death, they're worried. I don't want to die, I don't want to die, I want to stay here. And then there's also the losses of the people you leave behind. So you might, if you're a grandma, for instance, you've got all your grandkids and you've got all your kids and everybody that you still want to have a relationship, but they're going to be left here. And most people don't understand you can easily visit them. But even if you understand you can visit them, you're not going to be able to talk to them necessarily unless they're open to that, and most people aren't. And so a lot of people just get more and more afraid the older they get before they're passing. So I'm afraid, I'm sad. By the time I pass, I'm afraid and sad. And what am I going to do now with these feelings? Now, for most people, they go, these are bad feelings. I don't like feeling them. So what I'm going to do is learn how to progress in the spirit world with my mind, and then do that. And these spirits have encouraged people on earth to do the same. The people who do that in the spirit world have encouraged people on earth to progress the same way. And so what you end up happening is you end up saying, what is the transition between the first and the second sphere? What is that? What do I have to do to make that transition? Now, I can say what it is. You have to become focused on truth as your primary purpose in life. That's what the transition is. Now, once the spirit realizes that in their mind, they go, what is the truth? What is the truth? What is the truth? And what they do near the top of the first sphere to make the transition is, what is the truth? They talk to everybody, I meet Mary and I go, what truth do you know that I don't know? And if Mary's from the second sphere or something and I'm in the first, she knows something I don't know, for sure. So I need to ask, what's the truth? And she's sort of she tries to tell you, and you're in your mind trying to analyse it. What does that mean? What does it mean? I don't know. I'm not sure. How does that look? And you're developing your mind. Eventually you get it, using your mind, and you make the transition. Right? And then there's another sphere above that, and you're told there's another sphere above that. And what's the transition into that sphere? What do you do there? Well, now I've got to work out, what is that transition? I won't tell you that transition. But let's say it's another quality, a primary quality. So I'm told, now I've got to work through all the issues about that again in my mind. I've got to work through all the issues about that. Now, you can see, firstly, I am sort of doing this alone, aren't I? There's no help. I've not asked for help from God to do this or anything like that. I'm sort of doing it alone.
I realized that I wasn't praying.
Mm-hmm. That's right. In this place where sort of, it's a good place in some ways because you're learning more self-responsibility, which is a good quality, which God wants you to develop, by the way. So there are good things about it, but also you're doing it alone. And in the end, what do you find when you've done something alone and you succeed? You feel pretty like, I'm pretty good, right? And so there's also this sort of feeling of self-assuredness and the feeling you don't need anybody else growing in you, which is not strictly true, because beyond the sixth sphere, you're going to need God. right, to grow beyond that. So there's these feelings that start developing. I'm pretty good. I can get this done. All I got to do is find out the next quality and the next quality and what's stopping me from making these transitions. Now, I'm simplifying things a bit because obviously there's hundreds of things that stop you from entering the second sphere if you're in the first sphere. There's hundreds of issues of love that needs to be addressed, but you would have to identify every one of them and address every one of them individually. And then you'll progress. And you'll be able to measure your progress because the brightness around you and your environment will change. Every time you make a change, the brightness around it will change. So most spirits who enter the spirit world, most people on earth who enter the spirit world, this is how they progress. Exactly like that. And what I'm saying is you don't need to progress that way. But if you're mind bound, intellectually bound, you will need to progress that way for a while until you sort out your reason why you're so afraid of dealing with things on a more emotional level, right? But most people who pass, this is how they progress. From sphere to sphere, learning about love, learning how, so they learn what's the condition of love in the second sphere. I'm in the first. What's the condition of love in the second sphere? What do I need to learn? And literally this is what they do. They sort of make a list. It's an intellectual list, of course, because your mind is now, you can now use your mind 100% of the time. So, you know, and it's not limited by the human brain anymore, like the earth, the physical body brain. So you can use 100% of it. So you can remember everything, right? So big list. I've got a big list there. I need to do this. I need to do that. I need to do this. And if I don't know how to do it, I go and ask somebody who did. No, like so somebody in the second sphere, they obviously know because they're there. So I ask them. And so you end up talking a lot to people, finding out from them. This is the progress of the perfect natural man. But it's not the progress towards God. It's not the progress to divine. To the divine, you need to have a relationship with God. You need to have a relationship with God. It's emotional. It's not intellectual. You need to open and expand yourself emotionally in order to have a relationship with God. That relationship requires you to be open and larger and more expansive so that you can approach the infinite. God's infinite in nature. God's love is infinite in nature. God's truth is infinite in nature. And as you receive more of God's love, you approach the infinite. So to grow that way requires a completely different understanding. And it's not intellectual. You can't actually do it intellectually. It's impossible, actually, to do it intellectually. And in fact, in the seventh sphere of the spirit world, the one above the perfect natural man, you literally lose your mind. Like, it's a real thing. You go through the process of completely becoming emotion, soul dominant. And your mind is just a subservient servant to your soul. So you don't sort of lose the capacity, intellectual capacity, but your mind no longer dominates anything you do after that point. And in fact, you can't become at one with God without that happening. So that's the main job in the seventh sphere, is to actually go through the process of getting rid of mind dominance completely, intellectual dominance completely. That make sense?
Nelly, do you mind if I ask what happened when you realised you had the feedback and then you started to pray? Did you start to pray?
Yes.
Yes. Yep. And how did it change then?
No, it has completely changed my life.
Yep.
I started to sit down some moments of the day to try and do it. And it takes a while because it is difficult to get to a sincere point where I feel that I'm emotional. Mm-hmm. And I get to this place that you usually talk about, that it is both happy and sad.
Yeah.
Because I do feel that, wow, it was always there and I was not talking to him or her.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets very the regret of not having doing and thinking that I was in the divine love path.
Yeah. But it feels different immediately, doesn't it?
Yes.
That you're away from this study and more in this.
Yes,
yeah.
and it has made me remember of moments in my teenage years, and I used to have I felt some things. So yes, I do. I know right now that it is totally different. So, but I just cannot explain to people why, and to the people with whom I was working with, why it is different, and they do not understand. They think, no, but we are doing the divine love path.
Yeah.
And this thing that you were telling her that I was actively sharing this. I was doing videos and I stopped it all. So many people didn't have this link with me to what we were doing. So some of them just, one lady who's living here in Portugal, she just went into depression because she lost what I was creating a dependency, not on me, not linking them to God as I wasn't doing the linkage to God. Yeah. So yes, all that you've been saying has been confirmed.
Yeah. And this is the thing, is that it's only when you go through the experience that you can look back on the experience and go, oh, I get it now. Like when before the experience actually happens, it's a very confusing time because you think you're doing the right thing, you know, but you don't really even understand how to do it, even how to pray, right? And so this is where it becomes very confusing for most people. When they use their mind to listen to divine truth, they think they can be doing it, but actually the feelings are not involved, and therefore it's not actually happening. Yeah. And but it's very good you mentioned your experience, because it's exactly how it works. Yeah. Exactly how it works.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Toilet, can we have a toilet?
Oh, sorry. What do you?
Can we have a toilet?
Oh, can we go to the toilet? One more question, and then you can.
You can go.
You can go.
Is moving through the levels an absolute, or they feel like when you move into a place of out of the mind into a different state, and then you come back, or is it you go through one, then you go through two? Are they absolute movements, or can you go into a higher level, then you come back as you grow?
Good question. So let's just answer it. There's two things to consider in the answer to that question. One is, yes, the condition of change is absolute. Like when you go from one sphere to the next sphere to the next sphere, there is an absolute change in the individual from one to the other. However, there's something that also must be considered, and that is one particular quality of the soul that actually temporarily raises your condition at certain times, and that's the quality of faith. Now, the quality of faith is a very interesting quality, because it's about sort of believing with all of your feelings that something you don't currently have is available to you, is a reality. So it's like you know it's a reality even though you're yet to experience it, right? Now this quality of faith temporarily raises your condition to a new condition, and in that space you can receive, so if this is an individual, you can receive more inspiration than you could have done if you didn't have that faith. All right? So faith is an interesting thing to develop in terms of a soul quality. It's again one of those gifted potentials that God gave us to develop, but it's something that has to be personally developed in order to experience. Now, you've heard of the term faith healing. Well, all that is a person feeling with all of their heart, this emotional state, that a healing is possible, which temporarily raises their condition to allow a healing to occur. Make sense? But it's not a permanent change. The permanent change has to happen step by step as you progress. So the beauty of faith, though, is that it allows you to have a glimpse of the future condition. And that's a very powerful thing to motivating your desire to meet that condition. So an example of that is sometimes what we do in the spirit world. If we can just turn that off, that'd be good. So sometimes what we do in the spirit world is we'll give a person a picture of their possible future condition so that they feel inspired to attain that condition. And really, in a lot of ways, that's what I'm trying to do when I'm discussing things with you. Like, I'm trying to give you a glimpse of the condition, and it's hard because we've got to use a whole lot of words, you know, particularly to people who are very intellectual. You've got to use a whole lot of words to try to describe a feeling of the condition. But if I can inspire in you the glimpse of the condition, right, then there's going to be a stronger motivation in your heart to attain that condition. And that's a very powerful thing for your future. And one of the things that many people rely on earth and in the spirit world is spirits and other people coming to them and giving them a glimpse of the potential of their future. Because what it does is it causes you to be motivated to obtain that future. Yeah. And so why it's such an important question is because the quality of faith is what lets you temporarily raise your condition where the future appears real to you rather than just appearing imaginary, something to not aspire to. If real faith is there, you start to feel like, this is a real place I can go to. So an example of that is at one we've got. If I can somehow inspire you enough to realise and have faith that you can ask God for love and he will give it to you, then that will cause you potentially to ask. But if I didn't do that, your faith would be, what's possible, I don't know, who knows, it's not even worth trying, right? So this quality of faith is a very important quality to develop, and it's going to help raise your condition to have glimpses of your future that are not current in your life. But the second part of the answer to the question is yes, you're still going to have to make those adjustments of love as you progress through the spheres. So obviously, as you progress through the spheres, once you get to the 4th or 5th or 6th or 7th and so forth, your condition of love will be actually true. So you could say faith is like, an example I can give you about faith is, here's a physical example, not a very good one, but if you had, there's a difference between you having faith that you can walk through this wall, right, without there being a door there, versus you actually doing it. When you actually do it, you don't need faith anymore, do you? Because you know you can do it and you've done it. So faith is what helps you believe you can do something without having yet done it. Now, when it comes to receiving God's love, that's a very important thing to develop, because if I have faith that if I'm sincere when I ask, I will receive, then that puts me in a place where I feel the future will be if I ask, and so therefore I will be motivated to ask. Yeah, and that's why it's such an important quality to develop. And this quality of faith has helped me all through my life. Every change I've ever made has always been driven by faith first. Yeah, by this I start out imagining. Eventually, it turns into an actual feeling that it's real, because God, I can ask God about whether it's real. And so I don't go imagining things that are just like impossible. I ask God what's real, and then I try to imagine myself being there. Does that make sense? And in imagining myself being there, I start developing the quality of faith to the point where I feel I'm going to be there. And then once I feel I'm going to be there, I keep asking for God's love. eventually you get to the stage where you are there. And once you are there, you don't need faith about that anymore because you're there. Yep. So that's a very important quality to develop in your soul. This is a soul quality. But we need to now have a break, yes? So we can go to the toilet. So let's do that. Can we make a short break, like 10 minutes?